part two of this Nelson Mandela video of mine. I think we should pay very close attention as to how armed struggle comes into being and why. And that we cannot simply label an uprising, a general uprising, as something with violent motivations from the start. So in the context of all this, I'm going to read you the entire testimony of Nelson Mandela during his trial. This is going to be a very long video because it's a very long testimony. But there is, I think we all need to consider that violence should always be the last measure of resort. But once all democratic means and non-violent means have been exhausted, then essentially what do you do? What do you do from that point on? This is the question we all need to ask ourselves. And as I say, I don't condone any kind of violence whatsoever, personally. But there comes a point where I believe people will simply act in self-defense of their own values, of human rights in general. And there are lines that need to be drawn, and some of those lines, unfortunately, will involve violence. Now, I'm not a supporter, of blowing up, innocent school children because of some political cause. I think that usually backfires anyhow. It's a completely stupid tactic because you're not going to get any ordinary citizen on your side blowing up innocent people. Okay? But this is essentially what some of this asymmetric warfare is in part all about. And it should not be condoned by anybody involved in any kind of human rights activism. What I do want to say is once you lead such a movement towards human rights activism, you can't always control the members of that movement and how violent they themselves might get in the pursuit of that. So let me introduce you to this speech, to the testimony of Nelson Mandela when he was first convicted in 1964, and how this all came about, and why a less peaceful approach was chosen in this regard. So this was recorded in April of 1964. I am the first accused. I hold a bachelor's degree in arts and practiced as an attorney in Johannesburg for a number of years. In partnership with Oliver Tambo, I'm a convicted prisoner serving 5 years for leaving the country without a permit and for inciting people to go on strike at the end of May in 1961. At the outset, I want to say that the suggestion that the struggle in South Africa is under the influence of foreigners or communists is wholly incorrect. I have done whatever I did because of my experience in South Africa and my own proudly felt African background, and not because of what any outsider might have said in my youth, as at the Transkei, I listened to the elders of my tribe telling the stories of the old days, Amongst the tales they related to me were those of wars fought by our ancestors in defense of the fatherland. This is Nelson Mandela speaking. The names of Dingai, Bambata, Hintze, and Makara, and other people were praised as the glory of the entire African nation. This is way back in Africa. I hoped then that life might offer me the opportunity to serve my people and to make my own humble contribution to their freedom struggle. Some of the things so far told to the court are true, and some are untrue. I do not, however, deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have a love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation, and oppression of my people by the whites. I admit immediately that I was one of the persons who helped to form Umkhonto we, which is the armed faction of the ANC. I deny that Umkhonto was responsible for a number of acts which clearly fell outside the policy of our organization and which had been charged in the indictment against us. I and the others who started the organization felt that without violence there would be no way open to the African people to succeed in their struggle against the principle of white supremacy. All lawful modes of expressing opposition to this principle had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government. We chose to defy the government. We broke the first law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence. When this form was legislated against, and then the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition to its policies, only then did we decide to answer violence with violence. The African National Congress was formed in 1912 to defend the rights of the African people, which had been seriously curtailed. For 37 years, that is until 1949, it adhered strictly to constitutional struggles. But white governments remained unmoved, and the rights of Africans became less instead of becoming greater. Even after 1949, the ANC remained determined to avoid violence. At this time, however, the decision was taken to protest against apartheid by peaceful but unlawful demonstrations. More than 8,500 people went to jail. Yet there was not a single instance of violence. I and 19 other colleagues were convicted for organizing the campaign, but our sentences were suspended mainly because the judge found that discipline and nonviolence had been stressed throughout. During the Defiance campaign, the Public Safety Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed. These provided harsher penalties for protests against those very laws. Despite this, the protests continued, and the ANC adhered to its policy of nonviolence. In 1956, 156 leading members of the Congress Alliance, including myself, were arrested. The non-violent policy of the ANC was put in issue by the state, but when the court gave judgment some 5 years later, it found that the ANC did not have a policy of violence. In 1960, there was a shooting at Sharpeville, which resulted in the declaration of the ANC as an unlawful organization. My colleagues and I, after careful consideration, decided that we would not obey by this decree. The African people were not part of the government and did not make the laws by which they were governed. We believed in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of any government. And for us to accept the banning was equivalent to accepting the silencing of Africans for all time. The ANC refused to dissolve, and instead we went underground. Part 3 coming up.